the idea of how the rest of the world is looking at us right now with this evil man as president. As Greg Sargent writes, it's worth recalling that the racial struggles in this country have gotten international attention throughout the history of this country. He writes, during the Civil War, as Helena Rosenblatt writes in The Lost History of Liberalism, European liberals believed the long-term international survival of liberal democracy was, quote, linked to the survival of the Union, end quote, and saw Abraham Lincoln as a test for whether enlightened leadership could prevent popular government from sliding into despotism. That's what I'm talking about. There's always been that pressure, that downward pressure to keep this shit below the surface, this fascism. Another historian, he's mentioned in this piece, notes that the civil rights movement also drew intense global scrutiny. Quote, from the Montgomery bus boycott through Selma and beyond, the movement in the United States was an international story. Not only that, but it provided a template for suppressed racial minorities, no matter what their race was. And of course, it's never been white, but where black Africans in certain countries would horrible pressure on other black Africans. The culture in India that has a whole group of people called the Dalit who are barely considered to be human. So it's not, and I haven't meant to imply that globally it's only been white people who have done this. But let me go on. Movement leaders, civil rights movement leaders, regularly noted that the endurance of Jim Crow and the era's violent white supremacist resistance undermined our international moral standing. Right. And the historian writes, or he wrote that, when the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts passed in the 1960s, seemingly putting us on a better path, it sent a message to oppressed people around the world. Of course, that we had established a template on how to achieve human rights in this country, although a lot of the achievement of human rights in this country for racial minorities has been illusory at best. But we made it clear that the people seeking their humanity didn't have to be violent to get it. In fact, the nonviolence, which would provoke violence, because if you're a fascist state, I don't care if it's Alabama or Trumpism or Hitlerian attitudes, if you're a fascist state, what do you do with the people who respond to your fascism with nonviolence? Hitler sent them to gas chambers. Here in the United States, the white sheriffs used dogs and fire hoses and clubs and guns and ropes. So the message that was sent to oppressed people around the world during the Civil Rights Movement was, you don't have to kill Whitey to get your freedom, to get air to breathe, to get vistas to see, to get a job to call your own, to get a college education. You don't have to kill Whitey. You can do it a different way. And the rest of the world was impressed. And now we have Trump. Sargent writes, it's been widely noted that the Democrats are consumed in a debate over how aggressively to confront Trump's racism and white nationalism. But notwithstanding that most Republicans are sitting this out or actively rallying behind Trump, shouldn't this be a national debate? It should. Why isn't it? Why isn't this a national debate? Trump's racism. What are white people afraid of confronting if they confront this evil fucker in the White House and everything he stands for? What are white people afraid of? Sargent writes, a lot is at stake here. As Sean Illing at Vox notes, the sight of Trump, quote, leading a white mob in a chant about sending a black congresswoman home will be featured in history books for decades to come, end quote. History and the world are watching. Now, to a lot of Americans, jingoistic, nationalists, Christians all, that doesn't mean shit. They don't care who's watching. There's something about Christians, they love the flagellation. They love the self-denigration. They love the pain and the suffering, because after all, Jesus was pained and suffered, right? Christians welcome this shit rather than actively fighting against it. But Christianity is a victim and a victimizing religion. You have to be a poor put-upon Christian in modern America so that you have to run like a fucking little rabbit to the Supreme Court because a gay couple came in and asked you to make a fucking wedding cake for them, and you refused, and you had to run to the Supreme Court to say, I won't do it. What the fuck? One more. I think I have time for this. Margaret Flynn. Here's what Margaret writes at the Post. As thousands chanted, "Send her back," at a campaign rally Wednesday night in Greenville, North Carolina, the president paused to let it amplify. And he says he tried to stop it. Right. He listened for 13 seconds. I said 18. He listened for 13 seconds as the stray shouts stretched into a uniform roar. Some raised campaign signs or fists to the rhythm of the crowd as they yelled. Some only murmured along. A few were children, following the lead of the adults sitting in front row seats behind President Trump. "Send her back! Send her back!" they yelled in unison, advocating for deporting Representative Ilhan Omar, a Democrat of Minnesota, an American citizen and refugee, to Somalia, where she was born. The chanting echoed Trump's own racist comments on Sunday when he suggested that 4 minority congresswomen, quote, go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came, end quote, rather than remain in the United States. But while Trump's response to the condemnation was familiar, doubling down with the support of an enthusiastic crowd, Wednesday's chanting, last night's chanting, alarmed many observers who suggested that the president's invective could endanger the safety of the minority congresswomen and feed the country, this country's ugliest impulses. They're there. Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, said on Twitter, quote, "This is the sound of illiberalism, intolerance. Listen closely. It's a danger not just to immigrants and minorities, but to all Americans, end quote. How many innocent Germans who did not support Hitler were burned alive in the firebombing of German cities once World War II began? How many children and women and men and young people and old people were fucking incinerated by the Allies? They had no liking for Trump whatsoever. I mean, for Hitler, whatsoever. But the rise of Hitler put everybody's life in jeopardy. And millions upon millions upon millions of people fucking died because of it. Listen closely, Jonathan Greenblatt said. It's a danger not just to immigrants and minorities, but to all Americans. And the chant broke out after several minutes, according to people who reported on this, several minutes of Trump bashing Omar and suggesting she's un-American. And that built the momentum that would morph into the chanting and the shouting of send her back. And as Margaret Flynn reports, he repeated the false claim that she had supported al-Qaeda and said she, quote, minimized the September 11th attacks on our homeland, end quote. Trump added, just before the chant broke out, he said this, quote, she looks down with contempt on hardworking Americans, saying that ignorance is pervasive in many parts of this country. I've seen this before. Not on a first-person, in-the-moment event, but as his history. And it scares me to death. Nah, it terrifies me. Because we are so close to wide open, murderous fascism. We're closer than we've ever been. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcasts. You have your choice. You can listen to the ranting with the audio podcast or listen and watch me lose control with a video podcast subscription. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.